Welcome everybody to day 2 of this first ever Human Factors in Diving conference. And we've got another 15 presentations for the whole of for today. To start off with, I've got Professor Simon Mitchell, and he's going to talk about bringing human factors into healthcare. Now, Simon's a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Auckland and a very experienced rebreather diver. He was a member of the original World Health Organization Surgical Safety Checklist Study Group, and since that study has undertaken extensive research aimed at optimizing checklists and their use in the operating room environment. Now, Simon's presentation is about bringing human factors into healthcare, but how we can also bring that into the diving world. So there are many parallels between the complex processes involved in surgery and technical diving, particularly the potential for errors and omissions to result in adverse outcomes. Now, in both fields, there's been a reluctance to acknowledge human fallibility and embrace the strategies to reduce error. But the extraordinary success of simple interventions, especially checklists, in improving outcomes among surgical patients should now remove any doubt in divers' minds that embracing strategies such as checklists will improve their safety too. Simon, it's a pleasure to have you here and talk on this global stage for this conference. So to that end, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Gareth. I appreciate that introduction. Now, should I be seeing my presentation at the moment? Or?
So you need to share your screen as you did before.
Okay. You got it?
We do indeed.
Okay. Well, look, Gareth, thanks for the introduction and congratulations on pulling this meeting off. It's a fabulous achievement. And it's important, you know, I've been quite outspoken about this over the years. You know, I've often said that it's pretty funny the way we spend so much time on the internet arguing about what decompression algorithm to use or what rebreather is best, when right in front of us we've got this whole suite of strategies that are going to impact safety far more than any choice of, you know, VPM or RGBM or gradient factors or whatever. And I do think that this is a critically important subject, and I'm thrilled to be part of this. So look, my presentation today is on my experience of human factors in healthcare, and there'll be a particular emphasis, as Gareth's already alluded to, on checklists. And what I'm going to try and do is talk about some of the challenges we faced in trying to sell human factors in the healthcare space, and some of the lessons that we learned that might be relevant to us as divers. So, firstly, I just want to say I have no conflicts that are relevant to this presentation. And I also want to remind you that I am one of you. So I'm a diver. As Gareth mentioned, I'm a very keen wreck diver. I love my deep wreck photography, a bit of cave stuff. So I totally get the diving world and the challenges that go with it. And I just wanted to make that point because I think it is important that, you know, having a foot in both camps is important. But my day job is as an anesthesiologist, as they say in the United States, or an anaesthetist, as they say in the Commonwealth countries. The other person in this photo with me is a bit of a shout out to our South African colleagues who I believe are here. So that's Cecilia Roberts, a very prominent diving physician in South Africa, who came and visited us a few years ago. We tried to steal her, but unfortunately we were unsuccessful. But look, while we're standing in an operating room, let's reflect a little bit on potential personal medical experiences. So let's just say that any one of you now developed right lower abdomen pain and felt pretty unwell. You went to an emergency department and had an ultrasound or a CT scan. They diagnosed appendicitis. Then I imagine that your expectation would be that you would be taken to an operating room where we all look like this, and you'd have an operation to remove your appendix. And in that operation, you'd be cared for by medical professionals who've undergone extensive training over a huge number of years are extremely good at what they do and very, very unlikely to make mistakes. And at the end of that process, we'd have a happy patient with a good outcome. And look, the truth is, that's what happens most of the time, but it doesn't happen all of the time. And so stepping back a little bit in time now, in the early 2000s, we were well aware that perioperative deaths and complications occurred. The numbers there are actually kind of irrelevant. I mean, they depend very much on who you look at it for, when you look, how you look. But deaths and complications occur in modern healthcare. What's more important is that there was substantial evidence that many of these complications were avoidable, such as complications due to errors made during medical care. And actually, if you look at the environment in which it takes place, it's not difficult to see how errors could arise. So this is another photo of me. I mean, that's a slightly more complicated setup than one would expect for an appendectomy. But the point of it is that what you see there is a huge number of informational inputs. When things start to go wrong, you can see dynamic change in multiple parameters all at once. You've got to process that, make decisions on the fly. You don't have a lot of time, can't sit down, have a cup of tea and talk about it. And you can imagine in a dynamic, rapidly changing environment like that, then mistakes or omissions could easily occur. And that's not even to mention what's going on over the other side of the drapes there, where my surgical colleagues might be struggling with some kind of complicated issue as well. And if you look at that environment, and with all of this information coming at a practitioner trying to cope with it, it's not that different to the environment that you see in the cockpit of an airliner. So this is an A380 cockpit. I think we were at Singapore at the time, and it's much the same thing. Our airline pilot colleagues have to cope with large amounts of information presented all at once when things are going wrong, lots of change. And it's actually fascinating to reflect on how, given that that's the case, on how safe aviation has been made over the years. And it wasn't always that way, trust me. And one of the big influences on the current level of safety in modern aviation is human factors. And the bit that interested us about what our airline pilot colleagues do is the use of checklists. When I say us, I mean us in medicine. So we were well aware that pilots rely heavily on checklists to avoid omissions and errors. That little window you see there is displaying a checklist. You won't be able to read it. It's the before takeoff checklist for an A380. It's actually a pretty short little checklist, and I'll return to that issue of appropriate checklist design and the features of a good checklist a little bit later. But we were well aware that this was one of their principal strategies for improving safety in aviation. And so in the early to mid 2000s, we were part of an initiative that was started by the World Health Organization to design a surgical safety checklist, which is shown in this screen in its kind of first iteration. It's evolved quite a bit since then, but this is what it initially looked like. So basically it had three domains. In other words, three checklist or checking events occurred in each operation. There was one called sign in when the patient first came into the operating room, another called timeout just before the first surgical incision was made, and a third called sign out, which was done just before the patient left the operating room. And at each one of those points, there were a list of items that were checked on the checklist, as you see there. And the initial paradigm for running this checklist was that it was on a piece of paper, and the circulating nurse in the operating room would lead all three phases of the checklist by reading out the items off this piece of paper. And look, that paradigm can work. And in fact, I'll illustrate, just so you get a sense of what it looks like, I'm going to show you a little video of a simulated timeout with the circulating nurse leading the process. This is a simulation, so you'll see me acting as a surgeon. And this just gives you a sense of what the checklist looks like at timeout and how it should be run under that original paradigm. So let's show that first video, please.
Obviously, it's
stand by.
Yeah, so when we get this going, we had them running before. I'm sure it'll work. Yeah, just bear in mind it is a simulation, and it's designed to essentially show how this can work under that original design paradigm for the surgical safety checklist. Are we going to be struggling with this, or?
I have it now, so just one moment.
Yeah, okay, cool.
obviously it's
Apparently, tech is not going to be our friend at the moment, so hold on, and I will try reloading this one last time.
Yeah, just try one last time. Look, if it doesn't work, yeah, it's not great. There's a few videos in here, but you know, I can articulate the important points that would be illustrated by the video if that becomes necessary. Sorry about this, everyone. Videos always the way.
I believe I just tried it again, so I think we're good. I did a pre-test, so hopefully it will play nice now.
underneath the foot so that you maintain the flipped position.
Time for
Bolster underneath. It's important. Obviously, it's important to have a good bolster underneath so that you maintain the flipped position.
time for timeout, everyone? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Can we have introductions, please, at the first place of the day?
I'm Olivia, I'm the anaesthetic fellow.
Brenda, anaesthetic tech.
Daniel, registrar. Simon Mitchell, surgeon.
Abby's from things.
David, circulating nurse.
And I'm Jane. Okay. So we've can we confirm that we've got Matthew Fearon here? We checked his bracelet and identity earlier. And he's here for a left-sided knee arthroscopy.
Yep.
And
Good,
the GA. Are you happy you've got the correct side?
So left side.
It's marked.
Side's marked. Yep.
And imaging, we've got some imaging up on here. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Can you just check that? This is for Matthew Fearon. Yep. Good.
Excellent. And antibiotic prophylaxis been given?
Yes, he's had 2 grams of Catalan.
And thromboprophylaxis, we've put on a TED and cuff compressor on the side.
Cool. Switch on. Hands on. Thank you.
Okay. So any critical steps or concerns?
No, it'll be a routine arthroscopy, a little bit of trimming, nothing else.
Anesthesia?
No concerns from us.
Nursing?
No concerns.
Okay. And the patient did ask us earlier if they could have a photo to take out, to look at the
Sure,
side of the
no
knee.
problem.
I'll remind you about that once you're in. That's fine. End of the time out. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Happy to go?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's how a timeout was designed to look. And the key features to take away from that, because there'll probably be a few of my medical colleagues laughing about that and going, oh, well, it never looks like that because nobody engages quite that way. The thing to notice there is that everyone was engaged and paying attention, not doing anything else. In other words, participating in the process of the checklist. So with that background in mind, in the mid to late 2000s, we were one of 8 centres around the world where we looked at the impact of introducing that process into operating room practice where it currently wasn't. And that study was published in the New England Journal in 2009. Basically, we looked at outcomes for 4,000 patients before the checklist was introduced and 4,000 patients after the checklist was introduced. And what we showed was that mortality fell from 1.5% to 0.8% and complications from 11 to 7%. Now, those numbers might not seem that great to you, but in a relative sense, mortality was almost halved and complications fell by over 30%. You know, for a medical intervention, that is the most extraordinary result. You know, if that had been a new operation or a new drug, people would have hailed it as the most amazing achievement in medicine this century. I mean, it has been a very influential paper, but the point is that it was almost too good to be true, and many people at the time didn't actually believe it. There was a lot of controversy about this paper. You know, before and after is a relatively weak methodology. But anyway, to cut a long story short, subsequently, over a number of years, multiple other studies emerged which essentially all showed the same thing. If you introduced a checklist and used it, then it would reduce mortality and complications. Utterly extraordinary. And I think it's fair enough to, I think it's fair to say now that the argument about whether checklists work in medicine has just gone away. The issue now, the discussion, the conversation now is about how to make people use them, how to optimize their use. The key message I want to point out for a diving group out of that study and the subsequent studies that followed it is that the use of a checklist reduces errors and omissions. It improves outcomes in complex patient care, even though that care is undertaken by highly trained and knowledgeable professionals who you would not normally associate with errors and omissions. And in that setting, if it works, then why on earth would we expect a different result if we used it in diving, where there are quite a lot of commonalities? So, rebreather diving, for example, it's complex. It's undertaken by highly trained people who take a lot of pride in their level of knowledge and their skills, etc. But there are many failure points in rebreathers, and it is an error-prone activity. And look, you know, you don't have to look far to see examples of errors that have been made with rebreathers that have resulted in fatalities. So, rebreather not switched on, oxygen cylinder not turned on, oxygen cylinder empty, diluent cylinder empty, dry suit inflator not connected. Every single one of those, every single one, particularly the first 5, have been responsible for multiple rebreather diver deaths. Now, I imagine that there's some of you saying, well, yeah, but that's not the whole story either. There's plenty of other things. And at this point, I do want to make one distinction and say that error is not the only problem. So all of you who are rebreather divers will be familiar with the fact that many rebreather accidents relate to the use of old and faulty oxygen cells or other poor choices made by the diver. And I just want to point out that in the human factors sense, conscious poor choices are not technically errors. They have a different title. So an error is something that occurs when you're trying to do the right thing, but you mistakenly do the wrong thing. That's an error. A conscious bad choice, in human factors terms, often referred to as a violation. And that distinction is important because cognitive aids like checklists are effective in preventing errors, but they're not so successful in preventing violations. I mean, you think about it, checklist stops you from forgetting something. If you're making a conscious bad decision, you know, to cut a corner, save some money, save some time, etc., then it's not that you're forgetting it. You actually know exactly what you're doing. You're just choosing to do it because there's some kind of secondary gain for you. That's not an error. That's something different. And we don't see so much of that in medicine. We do see it, but it's not so common. And the rest of the focus, the focus for the rest of this talk is on error rather than violations. And that's an important distinction because the strategies that we use in human factors to overcome these things are slightly different. Checklists work for errors, but not so much for violations. And actually in question time, if people are interested, we can talk a little bit about violations and how you try and prevent them. Okay, so moving on, if we're trying to prevent error, there's 2 broad strategies. One is engineering, and there's lots of examples of that. I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but that's in that sense, you try to engineer out the possibility of making the error. But then there are human factors strategies, and that's what we're really here to talk about. So things like training, protocolization of practice, teamwork, encouraging communication, and then cognitive aids like checklists. So what I want to do is go back to the healthcare setting and continue the sort of story about our journey with the checklist and some of the things that we learned with it. So we had our WHO surgical safety checklist. It's 3 domains: sign in, time out, sign out, on the piece of paper. We were using it like we did in the trial. We had a trial that showed that it worked. So kind of good, right? Well, yes, but we learned very early on that it's no good just having a checklist and paying lip service to it. If it's going to work, you have to use it, and you have to use it properly. And there's been a number of studies that have demonstrated that. And I'll just illustrate that with this one. This is a study by a Dutch group that came out in 2012. What they did is they monitored mortality in their hospital over a period of years. That's the lighter grey bars. And that's mortality, perioperative mortality. So mortality associated with surgery. And then they introduced a checklist and continued to monitor mortality. And that's the darker grey bars. And actually, it doesn't really change much, does it? But then they subdivided the patients into 3 groups. One group where the checklist was used in its entirety and properly. And that's the line, the lowest line with the lowest mortality, a substantial reduction. Then there was a second group where it was used partially, and that really didn't change much. And then there was a group where they didn't use it at all, and that mortality in that group actually increased over the term of the study. A phenomenon not really explained in the study itself, and there's a variety of potential causes. But the point of this study is that it shows that if you want to reap the benefits of a checklist, you actually have to use it and engage in its use. So with that in mind, we were very interested in how we were tracking with the checklist in our own hospital. We audited that in 2011 and 2013. Both of those were published. And to our horror, what we showed, having participated in the WHO surgical safety checklist study with practice that looked largely like what you saw in that last video, we were not doing well. We were having trouble with compliance and engagement in the use of the checklist. And what I want to do now is show you, and hopefully, is show you a couple of videos that illustrate the sort of things that we were seeing that we were concerned about. So, Tim, if we're able to play that second video, that would be great. Let's just see, and contrast this against what you saw in that first video where everyone was engaged and participating. Let's see if we can run this. Exactly the same scenario.
Have a good bolster so that you maintain.
Are we ready for timeout?
Yep. Yeah, okay, yep.
Okay, so we all agree this is Matthew Fearon?
Yep.
Okay, and he's having a left knee arthroscopy and the GA. So you're happy with the leg?
Yeah.
All right. And antibiotics been given?
Yes.
Okay. And we've got TEDs and a calf stimulator on. Okay. Any concerns?
No.
And we've all worked together before, haven't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So that's good. Okay, happy to go.
So, you know, the contrast's pretty obvious, right? So, like in that video, the team just didn't engage. They carried on doing other stuff. They weren't concentrating. I mean, the nurse could have said, you know, my hovercraft is full of eels, and the surgeon probably would have said, yep, you know, it just is going to be ineffective. And very occasionally, we saw something like in this video here. So based on real events. So let's play that third video, please, Tim.
Can we go time out? This is
Thank you.
Everyone's worked together before, haven't they? Yeah, okay. So we've got Matthew Fearon, who's here for a left knee arthroscopy. Are you happy with that? Everyone okay with that?
Okay, we need to get on with this. Too much kumbaya going on here.
So in that setting, what you saw there was just open hostility, right? And look, you know, I'm not going to give my medical colleagues any points for guessing the surgical craft group that actually did come up with that quotation. But anyway, if someone behaves like that, if someone senior behaves like that, then that's it. The process is over. Everyone else will disrespect the process as well. And I'll come back to the issue of, you know, senior people modeling good behavior a little bit later on, because it's critically important. So we, you know, did a lot of navel gazing about this and asked ourselves, what's going wrong here? Why is our checklist process, having been one of the centers in the WHO study, what was going wrong? Well, we came up with a number of things. Firstly, with the checklist on a piece of paper, only the administrator could see it. And that meant that, you know, item omission or confabulation, adding items that aren't even on the checklist, would go unnoticed. Often it was actually done from memory, so they'd have the piece of paper in their hand, but they wouldn't look at it. And a critical thing that we decided was a big problem was our practice of getting the nurse to lead, the circulating nurse to lead all three phases of the checklist. Because what that created was the sense that the checklist was not something that belonged to the whole operating team, but rather belonged to nursing. And that this was something that nursing was trying to kind of push on the rest of the team, which of course was not true. You know, this was a mandated, you know, piece of best practice, but that's the way it appeared to other people. We got comments like, oh, it takes too much time. And I don't make mistakes. You know, we heard that a few times. And there was a perception amongst some senior medical staff, particularly surgeons, that the use of a checklist or adopting a checklist was in some way, you know, a declaration of weakness or incompetence, you know, that you'd need to use a checklist. So we clearly you can't fix all of those things simultaneously, but we came up with an idea to try and fix some of the most important ones. So what we did was we put the checklist, we took it off the piece of paper and put it on a poster, a separate poster for each phase of the checklist. So one for sign in, one for timeout, and one for sign out. We put the posters on the wall. They were big enough for everybody to see from anywhere in the operating room. And the next thing we did was we migrated the leadership of each phase around the three teams in the operating room. So the anaesthetist would lead the sign in, that's the poster you see behind me there. The surgeon would lead the timeout, and the circulating nurse would lead the sign out. And the idea behind this was that this would impart a sense of shared ownership. Each team would lead one phase of the checklist. And in other words, it becomes something that we're all doing, not just the nursing side of the operating room team. And we also, when we went to roll out this new strategy for running the checklist, we invoked a very strong program of promotion by what we call checklist champions. So we chose very senior people who were highly respected, and we knew that would be influential in affecting other people's behaviors. So champions to model good behavior. And what I'm going to do now is show you another video to illustrate the new version of the timeout with a surgeon acting in role. So this is a simulation, but this surgeon we chose because he was the president of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. So if people saw him going, okay, this is something we need to do, then it was going to strongly influence surgical behavior. So this is a timeout with the new checklist paradigm that we adopted with the posters on the wall. So we'll play that video, please.
All right, David, I think we're about ready here. So let's do a timeout. Everyone ready? Good. Okay, so let's reintroduce ourselves because I think there's been some changes since we did our briefing. I'm Ian, I'm the surgeon.
Tracy, circulating nurse. Gemma, anaesthetic tech.
Simon, anaesthetist. David, surgical registrar.
Carmen, scrub nurse.
Excellent. All right, we've got here John Simpson, and John is for a right femoral endarterectomy and patch. Is that?
Yes, consent is repair of blocked femoral artery and patch repair right leg.
Okay, and I've got the right side prepared. Everyone agree? Let's look. We've got some imaging up there. Everyone confirm that it is John Simpson's imaging. Yep, good, excellent. Antibiotic prophylaxis.
Yes, he's had 2 grams of ketozoline.
Excellent. And thromboprophylaxis. He will get heparin during this procedure. I'd be happy enough with just leaving it at that. I don't think he needs anything else in particular.
We have got a TD on the left side as well.
Yeah, good. That's a good idea. In terms of blood, have we got some blood available?
So group and screen, current, no antibodies. Blood's not on the floor though.
Okay. And critical events, vascular surgery, bleeding is one of those issues. Hopefully it won't be a big one, but that's the major concern. Any anaesthetic concerns?
We've got large bore IV access and an outline in case of bleeding. He's got ischemic heart disease, so he's at risk from that point of view, but no, he's good and stable at the moment. I'm happy.
Good. Any nursing issues? Okay, let's go. Let's have the knife, please.
So that process, this new checklist process, we rolled it out in 2015 with a lot of attention to trying to get senior people to model good behaviour. And then we audited our practice in 2016 and published that in BMJ Quality and Safety. And look, I don't want to get into the detail of the data, but what we saw was an absolutely stunning improvement in compliance and engagement amongst the operating room staff with that new paradigm. And in fact, we found it to be a sustainable improvement. So we're now seeing, you know, even today, 5 years later, that things have not changed. In fact, we've just completed an audit which suggests that our practice is even better than it was. In other words, it's become a self-sustaining process. Okay, so some of the lessons that have come out of this journey that we've been on with the checklist that could be applied in diving is that the checklist design and the approach to using it make a big difference to compliance. Now, it's not to say that what I see happening in diving will look exactly like what we've done in the operating room. But I think we're just getting a bit of video, premature video there. But the key point is that the design and the way you operationalize the checklist can make a difference. So we need to have that in the back of our minds as divers. Another important point is not everything can be checked. So you know, I see people turn up to diving sites with, you know, 3-page checklists of things that they're going to check on the boat. That eventually will not work because they won't use those checklists. They're not practical. What you need to do is pick a small number of undisputed killer items and use them on a checklist administered at an appropriate time, which I'll get to in a sec. The ideal way of doing it is a check and response process, a bit like what they do in the cockpit of a plane and a bit like what you saw happening in those videos I've just showed you, where someone's administering the checklist, but people respond. And I think the golden time, the time where it's most practical to do a checklist and where it's going to prevent accidents for us as divers just before jumping in the water. And I want to illustrate that with a final video. And this is a little video that I put together with Mark Powell, well known to many of you, the author of Deco for Divers, well-known rebreather diver, where this was literally videoed on an iPhone very quickly on a trip at Ponza. Shout out to Daniela and Andrea, fantastic people. And just showing what I think is a good idea, you know, a basic idea for a pre-jump checklist for a rebreather diver. 5 killer items, 5 or 6 killer items. Okay, here, run that video. Thanks, Tim.
All right. Are you ready to go? Okay. We'll do this pre-dive checklist, Mark. So can you show me your unit is on?
Yeah, electronics is on. Yeah, it's on. Head's on. Head's on. Okay, so oxygen is on.
Cylinder is on. And the manual add.
Perfect. And I'll have a quick look at your pressure. Yep, perfect. And Dill is on.
Dill is on.
Just have a quick look at your pressure.
And manual add.
Perfect. And your dry suit is connected.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, you're good to go.
Thanks.
So here's that list of rebreather errors that have killed multiple rebreather divers that I showed you before. We just checked off every one of those before Mark jumped in the water. It took 45 seconds. 45 seconds. If this had been done before every rebreather dive that's ever taken place, then there'd be several hundred rebreather divers who are still with us that aren't. And no one can argue that that is not doable or takes too much time, or that it is in some way a reflection of your incompetence that you need to do it. History tells us that these events have happened, so why wouldn't we want to prevent them? So look, just a couple of quick points about selling this. One of the things I think is very important is to have high-level management buy-in. In our world, in the diving world, that's probably the training agencies. So we need them on board. They need to be advocating this. And then I think it's really important to educate divers with the relevant evidence. One of the things I used to do would be to stand in front of a group of surgeons and say, or anaesthetists, you know, I keep on picking on surgeons, and just say, look, is there anyone in this room who doesn't want to improve outcomes for their patients? And of course, no one puts their hands up, right? And then you say, well, here's a cheap, easy to do, riskless strategy that is proven to improve outcomes. Why wouldn't we do it? And there's no answer to that. And the same argument can be used with divers. We have the evidence from parallel fields that it works. There is some evidence in diving, in fact. Why wouldn't we do it? If you're a part of a group, and you're adapting checklists to your own practice, then have input from all members of the group into checklist design. That gives a sense of ownership. And I come back to this thing about senior divers modeling good behavior. That is critical. If people like Gareth and myself and Phil Short and Jill Heinerth are out there in the real world using checklists, people will look at that and go, oh yeah, right, okay, we should do it. If they see us not doing it, then they won't do it. We've got to model good behavior. We believe in this. We need to walk the talk. So look, Ellen Mary and I published this editorial in BMJ in 2016 about cognitive aids in medicine. And we said, for example, no patient should be given a drug by an internist without a check on allergies, and no patient seeing a primary healthcare physician, a GP, with pyrexia or fever of unknown origin should fail to have a history of recent travel taken. There should be no need to teach practitioners this sort of thing, but there may well be a need to ensure they don't simply forget key elements of routine interactions with patients. You could easily change that to diving, and it might say something like this. For example, no rebreather diver should enter the water without a check that their oxygen and diluent cylinders are open and contain sufficient gas, and that the rebreather is switched on. There should be no need to teach rebreather divers this sort of thing. Of course there's not. We all know this, right? We all know this, but we can get it wrong. And history has proven that that's true. But there may well be a need to ensure they don't simply forget these key elements of safe diving practice. So let's go on a crusade, everybody. Let's make sure we're using checklists, and let's make sure we advocate for their use and model good behavior. So thank you very much. Sorry about the glitches with the videos. I think they're worth watching though. I'm not sure how the quality was for you guys. It was a bit sort of jerky over here, but I'm in New Zealand, long way from where you are. This photo is my last super diving adventure. Just a few months ago, we took blood gases, arterial blood gases from an elite free diver at 60 meters and on a breath hold dive, and back at the surface before he took a breath again. So that was a fantastic, fun adventure, and I don't get to talk about my adventures very often, so I just sort of chuck that photo in there. Anyway, look, very happy to take questions. Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, throw the floor open. I can't hear you, Gareth.
Oh, it's that thing of having the switch on the other microphone. Thank you for this fantastic presentation and some brilliant little quotes there, and just rewriting that piece at the BMJ at the end. And I think the hardest bit, from my experience, is getting over that piece of fallibility. People don't like to admit that they're fallible and they make mistakes. And with the ability to turn that round with, I'm going to say, the surgical environment, the healthcare environment, where you have, I'm going to say, probably a fair amount of ego in the operating theatre, that ego and hubris, and you could also almost say arrogance in the diving industry is almost those same things. So if people have got questions, please come into the I have a question table, and we'll invite you up onto the stage. One of the things that I would say is, to start that process off, what was your biggest challenge in creating change within the hospitals or the healthcare environment that you were directly involved in, and how does that read across to diving?
It was probably getting senior practitioners in medicine to embrace the concept that they're fallible. We do have a culture in medicine, the hero, the kind of hero practitioner. People go through medical school believing that if they get A's and they know their stuff and they're diligent in their practice, that, everything will be fine. But it's just not like that. And I actually think there's an element of that in diving as well. I think your point just before, Gareth, that, that trying to get people to front up to the fact that they're fallible is probably the biggest challenge we had. Interestingly, what's happening now, what we're seeing now, is having got our toehold, our foot in the door with the senior people and just getting enough momentum with them, we're seeing generational change. Like the younger doctors are much happier to embrace this. We're going to have a whole new generation of doctors soon who have known the checklist for their entire careers. And it's getting to the point, we're not there yet, but we're getting to the point, a little bit like aviation, where it's just part of the culture. A pilot would not dream of getting into the cockpit of a plane saying, oh, look, let's forget about the checklist today, right? It's just in their DNA that they do these things. It's how they work. And we're slowly getting to that point. But I think our biggest challenge initially was the senior people and trying to win them over and get them to see that it actually works for them. And that's where this modeling good behavior from very senior people came from. And that's why I'm kind of emphasizing it a lot in diving. There's nothing that will work as well as that. If people see their diving heroes using the checklist appropriately, using a checklist appropriately, then they will model that behavior.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think that was one of the key bits that came out of Rebreathe the 4 and 3, which you put the final sessions together, was those bits about checklists that said, look, they've got to be well designed, they've got to be available. And I think it's the design piece that is potentially limiting some of the adoptions. Yeah. And the conflict that exists between liability from a manufacturer training agency point of view to make sure that everything's covered, and the operational context of saying, look, if you give me a sheet of A4 with 20 bullet points on here, it ain't going to happen. So no. There is definitely a piece of research that can be put in there and saying, look, can we develop a global diving checklist that is the killer items, that is done by everybody, and it doesn't matter what agency, brand, or manufacturer brand you have, that becomes the norm. And then people will know what the checklist should be, in the same way that the World Health Organization surgical safety checklist did, was what these are. Yes, there might be some tweaks, but what the sequence is.
Yeah, I completely agree, Gareth. That sort of generic approach, that's why, that thing I did with Mark was intentionally incredibly simple, but it would be very effective if everybody did that, And your point about the 20 bullet point items, I've seen people get quite enthusiastic about checklists, but they turn up with very long checklists, and you see them do it once or twice, and then it just becomes inconvenient. So they start to think, oh, well, I kind of know it by memory now. And that, like, once you get to that point, the whole checklist thing's just flown out the window, because checklists don't work like that. You need to be using the checklist. It's not something you do in your head. Mnemonics can help, but they're no substitute for a proper checklist. But the checklist needs to be a short list of killer items administered at the appropriate time. It's okay to have a long checklist with a build checklist, for example, for your rebreather that you use at home, but that's not going to catch these things that occur just before you jump in the water. And that checklist needs to be kept very simple, brief, and highly selected items. But yeah, anyway, I'm just repeating myself. So.
No, it's really good, and it's worth reinforcing, and that social environment to make that, and support it. So Seb has got a question, so I'll bring Seb up. Over to you, Seb.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Simon. Thanks. Another great presentation. I was wondering if you've how you've dealt with convincing senior leaders in the field to adopt these, where they themselves may have had, or their teams may have had, a very low incidence of mortality, and sort of attempting to convince them that there is actually a problem to be solved. This is something that I'm struggling with in one particular team I'm a part of, is to convince them that this needs to be done, when they go, well, in 13 years, we've never had a problem, or we've only had 3 tiny problems. Have you run up against that? And
oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. No, it's a great question. Well, for a start, I'd say it's frequently not true. So there's often a difference between their perception and the reality. We have surgeons, or we have practitioners saying, oh, well, I never have surgical site infections. But when you actually go and look up their data on databases, they actually do. Maybe they just blank it out. But that's one issue. So the perception and reality is often incongruent. But yeah, I mean, some of these things are rare, but it's a bit like that comment I made before about going to them with the science. It may be true that, most rebreather divers have never had a bad accident or something go badly wrong, or jumped in the water with their oxygen cylinder switched off. I mean, I've never done that, but I know perfectly well from looking at the history of other rebreather divers that I could. And that's where I think you just have to use data intelligently. So yes, these things are rare, but they have catastrophic consequences when they do occur, and they do occur. And there's usually no problem finding or sourcing data to illustrate that point. And that gets me back to that comment I made during the presentation about, what I find with divers, and I love divers for this, trust me, there's a little bit of the diving physician, the engineer, the scientist in every diver, particularly technical divers, and it's part of what draws them into the activity. Well, given that, feed that curiosity. And so when people say, oh, well, I've never seen someone jump into the water without a scrubber in their rebreather, use the data from Dan that, where there are plenty of accidents just like that, where it's happened, and say, yeah, well, of course it's rare, but the point is it can occur. And when it does occur, it could kill you. In fact, some of these things are very likely to kill you. So even though they're rare, they're still worth preventing. And what's 45 seconds just before you jump in the water, so why wouldn't we do this? There are arguments. I totally get your point, and but there are arguments around it, and that's kind of how I would approach it.
I agree with what you said, and the attraction of like a minute or less than a minute seems unarguable to me and to you, but there are people who for whom it seemingly is an issue, especially if there's a commercial interest involved and we have a 3-hour weather window to do a 2.5-hour dive. Then people are just like, oh, that's just one more thing we don't need to deal with. So that's why I asked the question. But
Yeah.
thank you
Yeah,
for your insight.
Yeah, there's no magic bullet, Seb. You just have to try and educate people, and you know, and be a little bit Machiavellian. Appeal to the sense that lots of divers have, that they're evidence-based practitioners and that they like to do the right thing and they like to apply their knowledge. We'll give them knowledge to apply. That's how I would approach it.
Great point, Simon. And just to add on that, my view is I take stuff that's to show people's fallibility. I take it outside of the professional environment and show them their own fallibility and forgetting keys, talking about locking themselves out or anything like that, to talk about fallibility, and then you can segue into the professional environment. So if anybody else wants to chat with Simon, he's going to be in the lobby at the table that says "Meet the last speaker from Hall 1." And you can have a chat there with him. So Simon, if you want to make your way across the lobby and that table, that'd be great. For everybody else, at the top of the hour, so 10 minutes from now, we're going to have Sally Tyndall, who is going to talk about From the Stars to the Sea, and how aviation aerospace has infiltrated diving and vice versa. And she'll talk about the journey that she's on in terms of the astronaut and space programs that are out there. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you on top of the hour. Thanks very much.